Chapter 13. As Talisker was preparing their breakfast the following morning, Commodore Florenzel remarked to Tarzan that he wished they two could be employed upon the same work, that they might be always together. If there is ever the chance for escape, that you seem to think will some day present itself, he said, then it will be well, if we are together. When we go, replied Tarzan, we must take Talisker with us. Commodore Florenzel shot a swift glance at the ape-man, but made no comment upon his suggestion. You would take me with you, exclaimed Talisker. Ah, if such a dream could but be realized. I would go with you to Trohanadalmachus, and be your slave, for I know that you would not harm me. But alas, it can be nothing more than a pleasant daydream, enduring for a brief time. For Calfastaban has spoken for me, and doubtless my master will be glad to sell me to him. For I have heard it said among the slaves, that he sells many of his each year, to raise the money to pay his taxes. We will do what we can, Talisker, said Tarzan, and if Aeoponato and I find a means of escape, we will take you with us. But first, he and I must find a way to be together more. I have a plan, said Commodore Florenzel, that might prove successful. They believe that you neither speak, nor understand our language. To work a slave with whom they cannot communicate, is to say the least, annoying. I shall tell them that I can communicate with you, when it is quite probable that they will assign us to the same crew. But how will you communicate with me, without using the Minunian language, demanded the ape-man. Leave that to me, replied Commodore Florenzel. Until they discover in some other way, that you speak Minunian, I can continue to deceive them. It was not long before the fruits of Commodore Florenzel's plan ripened. The guards had come for the slaves, and the various parties had gone forth from the sleeping chamber. Joining in the corridors without, the thousands of others, winding their way to the scene of their daily labor. The ape-man joined the timbering crew, at the extension of the 13th tunnel, at the 36th level, where he once more attacked the monotonous work of shoring the sides and roof of the shaft with an enthusiasm that elicited commendation, from even the surly Calfastaban. Though Karaftap, who was removing rocks, just ahead of Tarzan, often shot venomous looks at the ape-man. The work had been progressing for perhaps 2 or 3 hours, when 2 warriors descended the tunnel, and halted beside Calfastaban. They were escorting a green-tunicked slave, to whom Tarzan paid no more attention than he did to the warriors. Until a scrap of the conversation between the warriors and Calfastaban reached his ears. Then he shot a quick glance in the direction of the fort, and saw that the slave was Commodore Florenzel, Prince of Trohanadalmachus. Known in the quarries of Veltopismachus, as slave Aeoponato, or 8003 plus 19, which is written in Minunian hieroglyphics. Tarzan's number, Aeopantando, 8003 plus 21, appeared thus, upon the shoulder of his green tunic. Although the Minunian form occupies less space than would our English equivalent of Tarzan's number, which is 512,021. It would be more difficult to read if expressed in English words, for it then would be 10 times 10 times 8 cubed, plus 7 times 3. But the Minunians translate it in no such way. To them it is a whole number, Aeopantando, which represents at first glance a single quantity, as surely as do the digits 37, represent to our minds an invariable amount. A certain definite measure of quantity, which we never think of as 3 times 10 plus 7, which, in reality, it is. The Minunian system of numerals, while unthinkably cumbersome and awkward from the European point of view, is, however, not without its merits. As Tarzan looked up, Commodore Florenzel caught his eye and winked. And then Calfastaban beckoned to the ape-man, who crossed the corridor, and stood in silence before the ventile. "Let us hear you talk to him," cried Calfastaban, to Commodore Florensal. "I don't believe that he will understand you. How could he, when he cannot understand us?" The fellow could not conceive of another language than his own. "I will ask him in his own language," said Commodore Florensal, "if he understands me, and you will see that he nods his head affirmatively." "Very good," cried Calfastaban, "ask him." Commodore Florensal turned toward Tarzan, and voiced a dozen syllables of incomprehensible gibberish, and when he was done the ape-man nodded his head. "You see," demanded Commodore Florensal. Calfastaban scratched his head. "It is even as he says," he admitted ruefully, "the Zertalakalol has a language." Tarzan did not smile, though he should have liked to, at the clever manner in which Commodore Florensal had deceived the Veltopis Macusians into believing that he had communicated with Tarzan in a strange language. As long as he could contrive to put all his communications into questions that could be answered by yes or no, the deception would be easily maintained. But under circumstances that made this impossible, some embarrassments might be expected to arise, and he wondered how the resourceful Trohanadal Macusian would handle these. "Tell him," said one of the warriors to Commodore Florensal, "that his master, Zoanthrohago, has sent for him, and ask him if he fully understands that he is a slave, and that upon his good behavior depends his comfort. Yes, even his life, for Zoanthrohago has the power of life and death over him, as much so as have the royal family. If he comes docilely to his master, and is obedient, he will not fare ill. But if he be lazy, impudent, or threatening, he may expect to taste the point of a free man's sword." Commodore Florensal strung out this time a much longer series of senseless syllables, until he could scarce compose his features to comport with the seriousness of his mien. "Tell them," said Tarzan in English, which, of course, not one of them understood, "that at the first opportunity, I shall break the neck of my master. That it would require but little incentive to cause me to seize one of these timbers, and crack the skull of Calfastaban, and the rest of the warriors about us, and I shall run away at the first opportunity, and take you and Talisker with me." Commodore Florensal listened intently, until Tarzan had ceased speaking, and then turned to the two warriors, who had come with him to find the ape-man. "Zuhanthrol says that he fully understands his position, and that he is glad to serve the noble and illustrious Zoanthrohago, from whom he claims but a single boon," translated the Trohanadal Macusian prince, rather freely. "And what boon is that?" demanded one of the warriors. "That I be permitted to accompany him, that he may thus better fulfill the wishes of his master. Since without me, he could not even know what was desired of him," explained Eoponato. Tarzan understood now how Commodore Florensal would surmount whatever difficulties of communication might arise, and he felt that he would be safe in the hands of his quick-witted friend for as long a time as he cared to pretend ignorance of the Minunian tongue. "The thought was even in our minds, slave, when we heard that you could communicate with this fellow," said the warrior to whom Commodore Florensal had addressed the suggestion. "You shall both be taken to Zoanthrohago, who will doubtless decide his wishes, without consulting you, or any other slave. Come. Calfastaban Vental, we assume responsibility for the slave Zuhanthrol," and they handed the Vental a slip of paper, upon which they had marked some curious hieroglyphics. Then, with swords drawn, they motioned Commodore Florensal and Tarzan to precede them along the corridor, for the story of Tarzan's handling of Karaftap had reached even to the guardroom of the quarry, and these warriors were taking no chances. The way led through a straight corridor, and up a winding spiral runway to the surface, where Tarzan greeted the sunlight and the fresh air almost with a sob of gratitude. For to be shut away from them, for even a brief day, was to the ape-man, cruel punishment indeed. Here he saw again the vast, endless multitude of slaves, bearing their heavy burdens to and fro. The trim warriors, who paced haughtily upon either flank of the long lines of toiling serfs. The richly trapped nobles of the higher castes, and the innumerable white-tunicked slaves, who darted hither and thither, upon the errands of their masters, or upon their own business or pleasure, for many of these had a certain freedom and independence that gave them almost the standing of free men. Always were these slaves of the white tunic, owned by a master, but especially in the case of skilled artisans. About the only allegiance they owed to this master, was to pay to him a certain percentage of their incomes. They constituted the bourgeoisie of Minuni, and also the higher caste serving class. Unlike the green-tunicked slaves, no guard was placed over them, to prevent their escape, since there was no danger that they would attempt to escape. There being no city in Minuni, where their estate would be improved, for any other city than that of their birth, would treat them as alien prisoners, reducing them immediately to the green tunic, and lifelong hard labor. The domes of Veltopismachus were as imposing as those of Trohanadalmachus. In fact, to Tarzan they appeared infinitely larger, since he now was 1/4 the size he had been when he had left Trohanadalmachus. There were 8 of them fully occupied, and another in course of construction. For the surface population of Veltopismachus was already 480,000 souls. And as overcrowding was not permitted in the king's dome, the remaining 7 were packed densely with humanity. It was to the royal dome that Tarzan and Commodore Florenzel were conducted, but they did not enter by way of the king's corridor, before the gates of which fluttered the white and gold of the royal standards. Instead they were escorted to the warriors' corridor, which opens toward the west. Unlike the city of Trohanadalmachus, Veltopismachus was beautiful in the areas between the domes, with flowers and shrubbery, and trees among which wound gravelled walks, and broad roadways. The royal dome faced upon a large parade, where a body of mounted warriors was at drill. There were 1,000 of them, forming an amok, consisting of 4 novans of 250 men each. The larger body being commanded by a kamak, and the smaller by a novand. 5 enteks of 50 men each compose a novand, there being 5 intels of 10 men each to an entex. These latter units commanded by a ventil and a ventex, respectively. The evolutions of the amok were performed with kaleidoscopic rapidity, so quick upon their feet, and so well trained were the tiny diadets. There was one evolution in particular, performed while he was passing, that greatly interested the ape-man. 2 novans formed line at one end of the parade, and 2 at the other. And at the command of the kamak, the 1,000 men charged swiftly down the field in 2 solid ranks, that approached one another, with the speed of an express train. Just when it seemed impossible that a serious accident could be averted, when it seemed that in another instant diadets and riders must crash together, in a bloody jumble of broken bones. The warriors rushing so swiftly toward the east, raised their agile mounts, which fairly flew above the heads of the opposing force, and alighting upon the other side in an unbroken line, continued to the far end of the field. Tarzan was commenting on this maneuver, and upon the beauties of the landscaping of the city of Veltopismachus to Commodore Florenzel, as they proceeded along the warriors' corridor, sufficiently ahead of their escort, that Tarzan might speak in a low tone, without the guard being cognizant of the fact that he was using the language of Minuni. "It is a beautiful evolution," replied Commodore Florenzel, "and it was performed with a precision seldom attained. I have heard that El Camoelago's troops are famous for the perfection of their drill. and as justly so, as is Veltopismachus for the beauty of her walks and gardens. But my friend, these very things constitute the weakness of the city. While Elcamoelago's warriors are practicing to perfect their appearance upon parade, the warriors of my father, Androharchus, are far afield, out of sight of admiring women and spying slaves, practicing the art of war under the rough conditions of the field and camp. The Amyx of Elcamoelago might easily defeat those of Androharchus in a contest for the most beautiful. But it was not long since you saw less than 15,000 Trohanodalmacusians repulse fully 30,000 warriors of Veltopismachus. For they never passed the infantry line that day. Yet, they can drill beautifully upon parade, and they are courageous, all Minunians are that. But they have not been trained in the sterner arts of war. It is not the way of Elcamoelago. He is soft and effeminate. He cares not for war. He listens to the advice he likes best. The advice of the weaklings, and the women who urge him to refrain from war entirely. Which would be not altogether bad, if he could persuade the other fellow to refrain also. The beautiful trees and shrubs that almost make a forest of Veltopismachus, and which you so admire. I too admire them, especially do I admire them in the city of an enemy. How easy it would be for a Trohanodalmacusian army to creep through the night, hidden by the beautiful trees and shrubs, to the very gateways of the domes of Veltopismachus. Do you understand now, my friend, why you saw less perfect maneuvers upon the parade grounds of my city than you have seen here? And why, though we love trees and shrubbery, we have none planted within the city of Trohanodalmachus? One of the guards, who had approached him quickly from the rear, touched Commodore Florenzel upon the shoulder. You said that Zuhanthrol does not understand our language. Why then do you speak to him in this tongue, which he cannot understand? The fellow demanded. Commodore Florenzel did not know how much the warrior had overheard. If he had heard Tarzan speak in Minuni, it might be difficult to persuade the fellow that the giant did not understand the language. But he must act on the assumption that he alone had been overheard. He wishes to learn it, and I am trying to teach him, replied Commodore Florenzel quickly. Has he learned anything of it? Asked the warrior. No, said Commodore Florenzel, he is very stupid. And after this, they went in silence, winding up long, gentle inclines, or again scaling the primitive ladders that the Minunians used to reach the upper levels of their dome houses, between the occasional levels that are not connected by the inclined runways, which are thus frequently broken for purposes of defense, the ladders being easily withdrawn upward, behind hard-pressed defenders, and the advance of the enemy, thus more easily checked. The royal dome of Elcamoelago was of vast proportions, its summit rising to an equivalent of over 400 feet, had it been built upon a scale corresponding to the relatively larger size of ordinary mankind. Tarzan ascended until he was almost as far above ground as he had been below ground in the quarry, where the corridors on lower levels had been crowded with humanity. Those which they now traversed were almost devoid of life. Occasionally they passed a tenanted chamber, but far more generally the rooms were utilized for storage purposes, especially for food, great quantities of which, cured, dried, neatly wrapped, was packed ceiling high in many large chambers. The decorations of the walls were less ornate and the corridors narrower on the whole than those at lower levels. However, they passed through many large chambers, or halls, which were gorgeously decorated, and in several of which were many people of both sexes, and all ages variously occupied, either with domestic activities, or with the handiwork of one art or another. Here was a man working in silver, perhaps fashioning a bracelet of delicate filigree, or another carving beautiful arabesques upon leather. There were makers of pottery, weavers of cloth, metal stampers, painters, makers of candles, and these appeared to predominate, for the candle was in truth life to these people. And then at last, they reached the highest level, far above the ground, where the rooms were much closer to daylight, because of the diminished thickness of the walls, near the summit of the dome, but even here were the ever-present candles. Suddenly the walls of the corridor became gorgeously decorated, the number of candles increased, and Tarzan sensed that they were approaching the quarters of a rich or powerful noble. They halted now, before a doorway, where stood a sentinel, with whom one of the warriors conducting them communicated. "Tell Zoanthro-Hargo Zertol that we have brought Zuhan Throl, and another slave who can communicate with him, in a strange tongue." The sentinel struck a heavy gong with his lance, and presently, from the interior of the chamber, a man appeared to whom the sentinel repeated the warrior's message. "Let them enter," said the newcomer, who was a white-tunicked slave. "My glorious master, Zoanthro-Hargo Zertol, expects his slave Zuhan Throl. Follow me." They followed him through several chambers, until at last he led them into the presence of a gorgeously garbed warrior, who was seated behind a large table, or desk, upon which were numerous strange instruments, large, cumbersome-looking volumes, pads of heavy Minunian writing paper, and the necessary implements for writing. The man looked up as they entered the room. "It is your slave Zuhan Throl Zertol," announced the fellow who had led them hither. "But the other?" Prince Zoanthro-Hargo pointed at Commodore Florencel. "He speaks the strange language that Zuhan Throl speaks, and he was brought along that you might communicate with Zuhan Throl, if you so wished." Zoanthro-Hargo nodded. He turned to Commodore Florencel. "Ask him," he ordered, "if he feels any differently, since I reduced his size." When the question was put to Tarzan, by Commodore Florencel in the imaginary language with which they were supposed to communicate, the ape-man shook his head, at the same time speaking a few words in English. "He says no, illustrious prince," translated Commodore Florencel out of his imagination, "and he asks when you will restore him to his normal size, and permit him to return to his own country, which is far from Minuni." "As a Minunian, he should know," replied the Zertol, "that he never will be permitted to return to his own country. Trohanadalmachus never will see him again." "But he is not of Trohanadalmachus, nor is he a Minunian," explained Commodore Florencel. "He came to us, and we did not make a slave of him, but treated him as a friend, because he is from a far country, with which we have never made war." "What country is that?" demanded Zoanthro-Hargo. "That we do not know. But he says that there is a great country, beyond the thorns, where dwell many millions, as large as was he. He says that his people would not be unfriendly to ours, and for this reason, we should not enslave him, but treat him as a guest." Zoanthro-Hargo smiled. "If you believe this, you must be a simple fellow Trohanadalmachusian," he said. "We all know that there is naught beyond Minuni, but impenetrable forests of thorn, to the very uttermost wall of the blue dome, within which we all dwell. I can well believe that the fellow is no Trohanadalmachusian, but he most certainly is a Minunian, since all creatures of whatever kind dwell in Minuni. Doubtless he is a strange form of Zertalakalol, a member of a tribe, inhabiting some remote mountain fastness, which we have never previously discovered. But be that as it may, he will never—" At this juncture the prince was interrupted by the clanging of the great gong at the outer entrance to his apartments. He paused to count the strokes, and when they reached 5 and ceased, he turned to the warriors who had conducted Tarzan and Commodore Florensal to his presence. "Take the slaves into that chamber," he instructed, pointing to a doorway in the rear of the apartment, in which he had received them. "When the king has gone, I will send for them." As they were crossing toward the doorway, Zoanthrohago had indicated a warrior, halted in the main entrance to the chamber. "El Camoelago," he announced, "Thagosto of Veltopismachus, ruler of all men, master of created things, all-wise, all-courageous, all-glorious, down before the Thagosto." Tarzan glanced back, as he was quitting the chamber, to see Zoanthrohago and the others in the room kneel and lean far back, with arms raised high above their heads. As El Camoelago entered with a guard of a dozen gorgeous warriors. And he could not but compare this ruler with the simple and dignified soldier who ruled Trohanadalmachus, and who went about his city without show or pomp, and oftentimes with no other escort than a single slave, a ruler to whom no man bent his knee, yet to whom was accorded the maximum of veneration and respect. And El Camoelago had seen the slaves and the warriors leave the chamber as he had entered it. He acknowledged the salutes of Zoanthrohago and his people with a curt wave of the hand, and commanded them to arise. "Who quitted the apartment as I entered?" he demanded, looking suspiciously at Zoanthrohago. "The slave Zuhanthrol, and another who interprets his strange language for me," explained the Zertol. "Have them back," commanded the Thagosto. "I would speak with you concerning Zuhanthrol." Zoanthrohago instructed one of his slaves to fetch them. And in the few moments that it required, El Camoelago took a chair behind the desk at which his host had been sitting. When Tarzan and Commodore Florensal entered the chamber, the guard who accompanied them brought them to within a few paces of the desk behind which the king sat. And here he bade them kneel and make their obeisance to the Thagosto. Familiar since childhood was every tradition of slavery to Commodore Florensal, the Trohanadalmacusian. Almost in a spirit of fatalism, had he accepted the conditions of this servitude that the fortunes of war had thrust him into. And so it was that, without question or hesitation, he dropped to one knee in servile salute to this alien king. But not so Tarzan of the Apes. He was thinking of Aidandroharchis. He had bent no knee to him, and he did not propose to do greater honor to El Camoelago, whose very courtiers and slaves despised him, than he had done to the really great king of Trohanadalmachus. El Camoelago glared at him. "The fellow is not kneeling," he whispered to Zoanthrohago, who had been leaning back so far that he had not noticed the new slave's act of disrespect. The Zertol glanced toward Tarzan. "Down, fellow," he cried, and then recalling that he understood no Minunian, he commanded Commodore Florensal to order him to kneel. But when the Trohanadalmacusian Zertolisto pretended to do so, Tarzan but shook his head. El Camoelago signaled the others to rise. "We will let it pass this time," he said, for something in the attitude of the slave told him that Zuhanthrol never would kneel to him. And as he was valuable because of the experiment of which he was the subject, the king preferred to swallow his pride rather than risk having the slave killed in an effort to compel him to kneel. "He is but an ignorant Zertalakalol. See that he is properly instructed before we see him again."